When an avoidant finally stops running, that's when you realize they were already gone. The moment an avoidant becomes calm instead of distant, it's not peace, it's acceptance. What looks like maturity, growth, or emotional regulation is often something much quieter and far more final: emotional detachment. Avoidants leave long before they physically walk away. They withdraw slowly, silently, and almost invisibly, piece by piece, until their presence becomes a shadow of what it used to be. Their calmness is not comfort, it's closure. It's the point where the running stops because the connection no longer feels like a threat, not because they finally feel secure, but because they no longer feel invested. When their panic softens, when the tension in their voice dissolves, when the reactive distancing turns into effortless silence, that is the moment you're not supposed to feel relieved. You're supposed to pay attention. It means they moved on internally without needing to announce it. Avoidants rarely say, "I'm done." They simply stop fighting the bond, stop protecting themselves from closeness, stop fearing the depth you bring. And while that might look like progress, it's actually resignation. They've accepted a narrative where the relationship no longer requires their emotional energy, where intimacy no longer feels dangerous, because they've stepped away from needing it at all. Their calm is a quiet goodbye disguised as stability. You feel it in the conversations that lose their spark, in the way they respond but no longer engage, in the way they hear you but no longer listen to understand. Their presence becomes technical, not emotional, functional, not intimate. This shift is subtle, but it is unmistakable. It's when their silence no longer feels heavy, when their answers no longer tremble with avoidance, when their distance no longer feels conflicted. The storm inside them finally settles, not because the relationship healed something, but because they've stopped caring enough for fear to exist. Avoidants run when they're overwhelmed, frightened, or deeply attached, but when they feel nothing, they no longer need to run. They stay exactly where they are, physically present, emotionally vacant. That is the real warning sign, the one most people misinterpret as reconnection or progress. The truth is, avoidants detach in two stages. First emotionally, then physically, and the emotional detachment is always silent. It doesn't come with an argument or a goodbye or a dramatic exit. It arrives in the form of calm acceptance, a soft shutting of a door you didn't even know was closing. When they stop running, stop resisting, stop keeping you at arm's length, it's because the bond has already loosened inside them. The danger is gone, not because they feel safe in the connection, but because the connection no longer carries weight. And by the time you feel that calmness, the avoidant has already grieved, processed, detached, and walked away internally. The body stays for a while, but the heart has already left. Their silence isn't distance anymore, it's finality. Their calm isn't healing, it's the end. If they no longer fear losing you, it's because they already did in their mind. Avoidants only detach when the connection feels too real or too risky. Their entire attachment system is built around one instinct: protect themselves from emotional exposure. As long as they fear losing you, it means they're still attached. It means you matter. It means they're still watching, still reacting, still scanning every emotional shift to make sure they aren't getting too close or too dependent. But when that fear disappears, when the anxious flinch softens, when the defensive walls stop rising, when they stop noticing how their silence affects you, that's the moment the bond has already dissolved in their mind. Avoidants detach mentally long before they detach physically. And this internal detachment is the clearest sign that something has shifted. They don't need to announce it. They don't need to warn you. They don't even need a reason to justify it. They simply reach a point where the emotional risk no longer exists because the emotional investment is already gone. What most people misunderstand about avoidance is that their fear of losing someone is not rooted in romance. It's rooted in vulnerability. When they fear losing you, it means you have access to their emotional world. It means you've reached a depth they don't allow many people to touch. But when that fear fades, when being close to you no longer feels dangerous, it's not because they suddenly feel secure. It's because they've stepped back far enough that closeness no longer touches them. They've already created distance inside themselves. So losing you is no longer a threat. The attachment has thinned. The bond has loosened. The part of them that once felt exposed has already hidden itself away. This is the stage where they stop reacting. They no longer read between your lines. They no longer monitor your tone. They no longer interpret your silence as abandonment. In fact, your silence becomes irrelevant. Where they used to overthink, they now underfeel. Where they once scanned for danger, they now simply drift. And while this looks like emotional maturity from the outside, it's actually emotional withdrawal. It's the moment their nervous system stops seeing the relationship as something to manage, navigate, or protect themselves from. That's because in their mind, the ending has already happened. And you feel this shift before you understand it. You feel it in the way your presence no longer pulls them closer, in the way your distance no longer alarms them, in the way they respond to you with a kind of neutrality that feels colder than silence. Their lack of fear becomes the clearest sign of emotional detachment, not because they want to hurt you, but because they've already accepted losing you as a possibility. They can emotionally survive. Avoidants don't detach when things go wrong. They detach when things feel too vulnerable, too unsafe, or too exposing. But once they've detached, losing you is no longer a loss. It's just a path they already walked in their mind long before you ever noticed they were leaving. Silence is not the problem, it's the comfort they find in it. If their silence goes from anxious to effortless, that's when they're not coming back. Silence itself has never been the issue with avoidance. It's their relationship with silence that tells you everything you need to know. In the beginning, their silence is tense, conflicted, heavy. They retreat, but still feel you. They pull back, but still wonder what you're thinking, whether you're hurt, whether they went too far. Their silence is filled with fear, doubt, and an internal tug of war they can't escape. They might not say it, but they're still emotionally tied to you, still hyper aware of the distance, still unsure of what it means. That kind of silence is painful, but it's also a sign that the bond is still alive. But there comes a moment, a quiet, imperceptible shift, where their silence becomes calm, effortless, natural. This is not avoidance anymore, it's retreat, it's resignation. It's the point where silence becomes more comfortable than connection, where it no longer feels like something they need to escape from or fix. When their silence no longer carries guilt or fear, it means the emotional thread has already snapped. And this is the moment most people miss because it looks like stability. You might think they're less reactive, more grounded, more emotionally mature. But what you're really seeing is detachment. They've found peace in distance, and that peace is far louder than any words they could say. Avoidants usually sit in silence, but still feel you. That's their normal. They distance, but stay tethered. They hide, but still watch the connection from a distance, checking whether you're still there, still waiting, still emotionally available. If they choose to return, but when the silence becomes home, when it becomes the place they feel safest and most themselves, the relationship is no longer a place they return to. Silence has replaced the relationship. Distance has replaced intimacy. Withdrawal has replaced connection. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring has become something they no longer allow themselves to experience. This comfort in silence signals something final, emotional closure. They've pulled their energy back into themselves. They've stopped wrestling with the bond. They've stopped hoping for a version of closeness that doesn't overwhelm them. Instead, they accept the distance as the new normal. And once that happens, they don't come back. Not because they're cruel or indifferent, but because silence now feels safer than you do. Silence doesn't demand vulnerability. Silence doesn't ask for growth. Silence doesn't expose the parts of themselves they don't know how to handle. So they stay in it, sink into it, let it become their refuge. By the time they're comfortable in silence, you're no longer someone they're afraid to lose. You're someone they've already set free in their mind. Their silence is not an invitation, not a test, not a waiting room. It's an ending delivered without words. And when they no longer feel the tension of that silence, when they no longer search for you inside it, that's when you know they're not coming back. When an avoidant stops defending themselves, they've already walked out in their head. Avoidants argue when they care. They defend themselves not because they want conflict, but because conflict proves they're still emotionally invested. Even their withdrawal is a form of engagement. It means they're overwhelmed, not indifferent. When they shut down and come back, when they distance and then return with explanations or attempts at repair, it's because the connection still carries weight. You matter enough to trigger their defenses, enough to activate their fears, enough to pull them into the cycle of push and pull that defines avoidant attachment. As long as they react, even in confusing, inconsistent ways, they are still tied to you. Their emotional system is still in motion. Their inner world still revolves, even partially, around your presence. But the moment they stop defending themselves, the moment they stop justifying their distance or explaining their behavior, something deeper has shifted. Avoidants don't abandon their defenses because they suddenly feel safe. They abandon them because the emotional investment that required those defenses has already dissolved. They no longer feel the need to protect themselves from closeness because they no longer feel the closeness at all. They no longer fear being misunderstood because they're no longer attached to being understood. The conflict no longer matters because the relationship no longer holds the emotional power it once did. This is the stage that catches most people off guard. You expect avoidance to fight less when things get better, but in reality, they fight less when they're already gone inside. But an avoidant is still trying, even awkwardly, even inconsistently, you can feel their presence in the tension. But when that tension disappears, when they respond with neutrality instead of emotion, with indifference instead of defensiveness, it's not peace. It's detachment. It's the moment they've walked out in their head long before they walk out in reality. You'll notice the shift in subtle, chilling ways. They no longer correct your assumptions. They no longer clarify misunderstandings. They no longer reassure you, even in the minimal ways they used to. They stop saying, I didn't mean it like that, or I'm sorry, I just needed space. Their silence becomes a wall you can't scale. Not because they're angry, but because they simply don't care enough to explain what's happening inside them. Their lack of defense isn't an act of maturity, it's an act of emotional exit. Avoidants defend themselves when they still believe the relationship is something to salvage, something that matters, something they can't entirely walk away from. But once they stop defending, they've already detached from the outcome. They've released themselves from the emotional responsibility they used to fear. They've accepted a version of reality where the relationship no longer requires their effort or their vulnerability. And when that acceptance settles, the bond becomes something they observe rather than participate in. By the time an avoidant reaches this point, they're no longer conflicted. They're no longer torn between closeness and escape. They've chosen escape silently, internally, and completely. The arguments stop not because they've healed, but because they've given up. The withdrawal stops feeling chaotic and becomes eerily calm. This is emotional departure disguised as quiet. And when an avoidant reaches the place where nothing needs defending anymore, the relationship is already over, even if the goodbye hasn't been spoken yet. If the avoidant stops monitoring your reactions, the attachment is gone. Avoidants always watch from a distance. Even when they pull back, even when they disappear into their own world, they're still paying attention in subtle, invisible ways. They're tracking your tone, your energy, your patterns. They're noticing whether you're upset, whether you're hurt, whether you're still waiting for them. They may not reach out, but they are observing. They watch to see if you've changed your mind, if you're still open, if you're still emotionally available when they feel safe enough to re-engage. The silent monitoring is their version of staying connected. It's not direct, it's not verbal, and it's certainly not reassuring. But it's there, and as long as the avoidant is still watching you, the bond is still alive. As long as they care how you interpret their silence, there's still a thread between you. But when that monitoring stops, when they no longer check for your reactions, when they no longer hover at the edges of your emotional world, the attachment has already dissolved. Avoidants don't stop caring. Suddenly or dramatically, they stop caring quietly. The emotional thread thins until it snaps without sound. You don't notice it immediately because the avoidance behavior looks identical from the outside. They're still silent. They're still distant. They're still withdrawn. But the difference is in the absence of attention. Their silence no longer carries curiosity, guilt, or worry. They no longer wonder whether they've upset you. They no longer care whether you've walked away. They no longer fear the consequences of their distance. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. Their messages, if they send any, become flat, practical, emotionless. Their responses lose their depth. Their timing becomes unpredictable, not because they're overwhelmed, but because you're no longer a priority in their internal world. Where they once read into your silence, now they simply move on. Where they once cared about your disappointment, they now feel indifferent. That internal monitoring, the quiet emotional radar they kept pointed at you, simply shuts off. Avoidants monitor reactions because closeness feels dangerous. They need to know where you stand so they can regulate their own vulnerability. But when the bond breaks inside them, there's nothing left to regulate. Your emotions no longer influence their behavior. Your silence no longer triggers their fear. Your presence no longer stirs their conflict. They step out of the emotional ecosystem the relationship once created, leaving you in a conversation they're no longer participating in. And this is the clearest sign they're not coming back. Not the silence itself, but the absence of tension in that silence. Not the distance, but the comfort they now find in it. Not the withdrawal, but the fact that they no longer look back to see how far they've gone. When an avoidant stops checking whether they still matter to you, it's because they've accepted a world where they don't. When they stop caring how you interpret their actions, it's because your interpretation is no longer tied to their identity or sense of safety. By the time an avoidant stops monitoring your reactions, the emotional connection is no longer real to them. You may still feel the bond, but they've already stepped outside of it. At that point, silence isn't a test. Distance isn't fear. Withdrawal isn't conflict. It's simply the end, delivered without a word. Indifference is the avoidance, true goodbye. Not anger, not anxiety, not shutdown, indifference. When your presence or absence feels the same to them, the emotional cord has already been cut. This is the moment most people misinterpret because indifference doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't shake the room. It doesn't hurt loudly. In fact, it often arrives as a kind of eerie calm, the kind that feels like clarity but is actually emotional vacancy. Avoidants don't announce their final exit with explosive arguments or cruel words. They don't burn bridges. They simply stop feeling something they used to fight so hard against. And when that feeling disappears, so does their attachment. Avoidance can handle anger, theirs and yours. They can handle conflict, tension, and even moments of emotional overwhelm. They can handle shutting down, pulling away, freezing out, even disappearing for a while. All of these are reactions rooted in caring, rooted in fear, rooted in emotional entanglement. But indifference? That's different. Indifference means the emotional system is no longer activated. You no longer reach them. You no longer disrupt their internal landscape. You no longer exist as a threat, a comfort, or a possibility. You simply exist, and whether you do or don't makes no difference to them. This is the true goodbye, the one they never speak aloud. You can feel it in the way conversations flatten, in the way their eyes no longer search yours, in the way their responses become devoid of nuance, warmth, or tension. You can feel it in the shift from I need space to I don't care if you're here. Anger can mean love. Anxiety can mean fear of losing the bond. Shutdown can mean overwhelm. But indifference means the bond no longer exists. Avoidants rarely reach this place quickly. It's a slow fade, an internal unraveling. They often oscillate between closeness and withdrawal, between wanting connection and fearing it, between reaching out and retreating. As long as these cycles continue, the attachment is still alive. The tug of war is exhausting but meaningful. Yet the moment the tug stops, the moment they no longer pull away because they no longer feel pulled, the relationship becomes something they observe from the outside rather than participate in. Indifference is not cruelty. It is emotional detachment. It is the point where they've protected themselves so deeply that nothing gets in anymore. And by the time they reach this emotional flatline, they've already rewritten the story in their mind. The relationship is no longer an active chapter. They've tucked it away, processed it in their own distant, quiet way, and moved forward internally long before the external ending occurs. When they stop noticing your absence, it's because they've replaced the internal impact of your presence with self-containment. When they stop caring about your reactions, it's because your emotional world no longer influences theirs. When they no longer feel guilt, pressure, or fear around you, it's because they've stepped out of the emotional contract completely. Indifference is the avoidance cleanest cut. Silent, swift, invisible. It's not meant to hurt you. It's simply the way they exit without confrontation, without chaos, without vulnerability. And when your presence or absence feels the same to them, it's because somewhere deep inside, they've already said their goodbye. When the avoidant starts planning without you, they've already accepted the ending. Avoidants don't end relationships loudly. They don't slam doors, deliver final speeches, or announce their emotional exit. They end them quietly, almost invisibly, by building a life where you're no longer a factor. This is their true point of no return. While other attachment styles rely on conversation or closure, avoidants rely on internal shifts. They make their decisions in silence long before you ever see the external change. And the clearest sign the emotional door has closed is when they start shaping a future that doesn't include you in even the smallest ways. Avoidants live largely in their internal world, and that world is driven by safety, autonomy, and predictability. When they care for someone, that internal world expands. They begin to picture you in their routines, their choices, their future. Even if they act distant, even if they struggle with closeness, you're still part of the blueprint. They think about how decisions affect you. They consider your feelings, your presence, your role. They might not verbalize it, but you're still in the imagined future they carry inside. But when that stops, when they begin making plans without even factoring you in, the emotional attachment has already been severed. Avoidants don't consciously decide, I'm removing you from my future. It happens gradually, almost instinctively. As their internal bond loosens, the more disconnected they feel, the more self-contained their plans become. They start imagining scenarios where your reactions don't matter, where your input is irrelevant, where your presence is optional. And once your presence becomes optional in their mind, the relationship is already over. This shift often appears subtle at first. They stop asking about your schedule. They stop discussing upcoming decisions. They stop checking whether you'll be okay with something. They stop saying we and start saying I. Their plans begin to feel distant, individual, separate. They no longer mention future trips, future goals, or future possibilities that involve you. Instead, their world shrinks back to the one-person universe they lived in before you arrived. This is not vindictive, it's defensive. Avoidance place people into their future only when they feel emotionally connected. So when that connection fades, their instinct is to prepare for life without the emotional risk of closeness. That preparation becomes their silent goodbye. They don't discuss it because discussing it would require vulnerability. They don't justify it because justification would require acknowledging the shift. They simply start walking paths where you're not invited, sometimes without fully realizing they're doing it. By the time they're actively planning without you, they've already accepted the internal ending. They're no longer trying to balance independence with intimacy. They've defaulted entirely back to independence. The thought of losing you no longer triggers fear because they've already built an emotional world where the loss has been processed. They've grieved privately. They've adjusted quietly. They've rehearsed life without you in their mind enough times that it no longer feels like a loss, just a continuation. When an avoidant reaches this point, there is no dramatic farewell, no closure, no explanation. Their goodbye is written in the future they no longer picture you in. And once they've built that future, they rarely turn back. The silent planning, the individual path, the absence of us is the moment you realize the relationship didn't end when they left. It ended when they stopped imagining a life with you at all. If the avoidant gives you space without expecting you to return, it wasn't space, it was exit. Avoidants usually pull away but still keep the door cracked for you. Their distance is rarely a full departure. It's more of a temporary retreat, a self-regulating pause, a way to breathe without losing the connection entirely. Even when they disappear, there's always a part of them checking the door, glancing back, wondering if you're still there. Their silence still holds expectation. Their distance still holds hope. Their absence still holds attachment. They step away, but they don't step out. They want you close enough to return to, but far enough not to overwhelm them. This is why avoidance space is never clean. It's loaded with tension, fear, longing, and unspoken desire for reassurance. As long as they expect you to be waiting, the bond is alive. But when an avoidant gives you space without expecting you to return, that's not space anymore. That's exit. That's the quietest and most final shift in their entire attachment pattern. It means they've crossed the internal threshold from I need space to feel safe to I no longer need this connection at all. When they stop peeking through the crack, stop checking if you're still loyal, stop wondering how you feel about their withdrawal. The relationship has already ended for them on an emotional level. This is not a dramatic moment. It is a silent one, a turning, a shutting of something only they can see. Avoidants rarely slam the door. They simply close it gently, quietly, completely, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. And this acceptance is the most heartbreaking part because it comes after they've spent so long oscillating, fighting with themselves, navigating their fear of closeness and fear of loss. When they finally accept the ending, it means they no longer feel the need to manage. And they don't fear being too close or too far. They don't fear hurting you or losing you. They don't fear the emotional consequences of their space. They've stepped outside the emotional equation entirely. You feel the shift in the way their silence changes. It's no longer tense, no longer conflicted, no longer waiting. Their absence stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a void. They stop responding as if you matter. They stop returning as if they owe you something. They stop keeping themselves emotionally available, just in case. Their space becomes permanent, even if they never say the words. They stop leaving crumbs of hope. They stop lingering at the edges of your life. They stop being someone who might come back. And avoidants keep the door cracked. They're still attached. When they close it, they're gone. And what makes this so quiet, so easy to misread, is that avoidants don't close doors with cruelty. They close them with numbness, with exhaustion, with emotional self-preservation. They don't want a dramatic ending because that would require vulnerability. Instead, they give you space that feels too big, too empty, too final, a space that no longer invites you in. By the time they give you space without a return path, they've made peace with the ending long before you realize the ending has even begun. Their goodbye wasn't spoken. It was chosen. And once chosen, they rarely reopen the door. They close themselves. When the avoidant feels nothing when you walk away, that's when they're gone for good. Avoidants feel everything more intensely than they ever admit. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's overload. Their distance isn't coldness, it's emotional panic dressed as control. So when an avoidant truly reaches a point where your absence creates no ripple, no sting, no internal negotiation, something significant has already happened. They disconnected long before you walked away. Most people misunderstand avoidance. They assume the avoidant never cared because the avoidant rarely shows care in ways that are loud, consistent, or stable. But avoidants don't express emotion in volume. They express it in tension. And that tension is the invisible thread that keeps them tied to the relationship even while they seem distant. So when that tension disappears, that's not peace, that's departure. The clearest sign? Your silence no longer activates them. In the past, when you pulled back, they noticed. Maybe they didn't chase, maybe they didn't know how to reach out, maybe they froze, but they felt it. Their avoidance was a defense mechanism, not a lack of attachment. If your withdrawal used to make them uneasy, and now it does nothing at all, you've reached the final stage, emotional severing. Because avoidants don't detach overnight, they detach in layers. At first, they feel guilty for hurting you. Then they feel overwhelmed for not knowing how to fix it. Then they feel afraid that trying will only make it worse. Then they begin shutting down the parts of themselves that care, not because they don't value the connection, but because caring has always felt dangerous. And eventually, after enough internal conflict, enough emotional overload, enough self-protection, they go numb. The numbness is the avoidance final goodbye. It isn't coldness, it's exhaustion. The kind that comes after years of emotional self-defensiveness that they never fully understood or untangled. The kind that convinces them that disconnecting is safer than trying again. When you walk away and the avoidant doesn't flinch, it's not that you weren't important. It's that they shut down the part of themselves that was capable of recognizing importance at all. By the time you leave, they've already rehearsed your absence in their mind. They've already convinced themselves that losing you is less painful than risking emotional closeness again. They've already chosen the version of themselves that needs nobody, even though it makes them lonelier than they ever admit. And the saddest part, you walking away wasn't the moment they let go. It was simply the moment you realized they already had. When an avoidant feels nothing as you walk away, it isn't apathy, it's closure, not the healthy kind, the survival kind, the kind they won't come back from. If an avoidant loses the fear of losing you, that's the final detachment. Avoidants don't stay connected because they feel safe, they stay connected because they feel pulled. The bond may overwhelm them, trigger them, stretch them, scare them, but it still anchors them in some invisible way. There is always a tension, a quiet fear that if they push too far, you might actually walk away. That fear is not weakness, it's attachment. And for avoidance, attachment, even fragile, conflicted attachment, means something is still alive. So when that fear disappears, when the thought of losing you no longer creates hesitation, no pause, no internal negotiation, no emotional tremor, that's the moment the relationship has reached its silent, irreversible end. Avoidants live in a cycle. Push when intimacy feels threatening, pull when distance feels too empty. It's not manipulation, it's emotional survival coded into them long before they ever met you. The push pull is their way of staying close without feeling overwhelmed. It's the only way they know how to love without drowning in the weight of it. So, if both the push and the pull stop mattering, if they no longer worry about pushing you away, if they no longer feel the instinct to pull back toward you when you drift, you're not in a relationship with them anymore, not emotionally. You're standing in the aftermath. When an avoidant loses the fear of losing you, it means the attachment system has gone fully offline. They're not protecting themselves from closeness, they're protecting themselves from caring. They've shut down the part of them that could be hurt by losing you because at some point they decided that the emotional cost of connection outweighed the comfort it gave them. This doesn't happen suddenly, it happens after. Too many unresolved conflicts, too many cycles of connection and retreat, too much internal shame. Too many moments where they felt like they were failing you, too much pressure on their fragile emotional wiring. Eventually, their nervous system chooses the only thing that feels safe: detachment that doesn't require grief. And that's why it looks like they don't care. But it's not that simple. They cared so much for so long in ways they couldn't handle that numbness became the only option left. You'll know they've reached this place because your reactions no longer register with them. Your silence doesn't stir them. Your absence doesn't unsettle them. Your presence doesn't soothe them. The bond that once triggered their fear of loss can't hurt them anymore because they've disconnected entirely from the version of themselves that bonded with you in the first place. And once they reach that stage, there is no pull left. No inner gravity, no instinct to repair, no part of them afraid of losing you, because in their mind, they already did, and they've finally accepted it.